So yeah, what did you think about the self-immolator?
um, I don't know if I have much of a take on extravagant like pageantry. I don't know if it's pageantry. Someone who does that clearly has a deep-seated belief about something. Um, yeah, I mean it's probably more of a bubbling proxy for like this seriously intense uh, feelings that are more than just like a Ukraine type expression where you have a moral standing, but you're not going to do anything about it. Like the Palestinian Israel thing seems like it's going to increasingly be more and more. You have terrorist like events and things like that. It seems to be a degree of temperature that's hotter than any kind of war disagreement I've seen in recent times. You know, you never saw this with the Iraq war. You haven't seen it for the Ukrainian war, right? Like these other wars almost seem like more corporate wars, whereas this one seems to be like very deep seated religious hatred. Like it just hits differently, and that means it's almost kind of a proxy for that, I guess. So
Well, I mean, I think the reason for that is because the whole issue is so astroturfed, right? That it's like, it's the same reason why people become insanely anti-Semitic, because when you're telling someone you can't say or think this all the time, their response is going to be to say and think it. And when they are constantly hearing, when there's
yeah,
so many fake organizations telling you don't say anything bad about Israel, and especially
yeah,
Israel's like increasingly terrible at propaganda of all kinds.
yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah.
just so bad, and they're just so heavy-handed. And when you're seeing that all the time, and you're like, well, wait a second, why can't I say anything bad about Israel? I'm a fucking American.
Right, right.
And
Well,
you're already left wing, like it just starts to drive you crazy,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. And what it does is it dilutes the impact of the term anti-Semitic,
right.
because now if it's any criticism of a national actor is deemed this, well, it's like fuck it then. Okay, I don't care, whatever. Now the word is diluted, and now genuine anti-Semitism and like and this like branded I just don't agree with Israel is conflated, and now people are like, well, it doesn't work as a smear anymore. You've kind of
Well,
seen it
and
happen with
and
racists
and
too,
what
right? You know,
is
racist.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, totally. And it's the same thing with racist. I mean, like, right. And it's like, what is so bad? This is what I always say. It's like, oh, Kanye West said, uh, that he just said, like, I'm going DEF CON on the Jews, which is just like a ridiculous thing to say. And I'm just like, oh, that means like you can't say anything bad about Jews ever. Like you can't even say any, there's no criticism at all, or else your entire life is destroyed. Like, surely you can't. That can't possibly be sustainable. You know what I mean? Like how can that policy? You're really gonna like keep
Yeah,
that policy that anybody who even says any slight crazy anything is
yeah.
immediately deplatformed and their lives are destroyed. Like
And you
that's
know what's rough
obviously
about
not
that
workable.
too?
What?
It's so like in contradistinction to like or contradicts like basic psychology of how you get someone to stop being that anyway is to
Yeah.
not give a shit. Like it's the most like, all right, like you're an asshole, fine, like
Yeah.
move
Ha
on with your day.
ha.
Where it's
Right.
like when
Yeah.
they freak out, it's, you can't. That's the one thing you get shut down with immediately. It's like it provokes this kind of thing. Like, why is this the
Yeah.
it's literally like psychologically the last thing you do. And this like brand of like the neoliberal response stuff is to inherently like clamp down on it in such a way it's never to let it roll off your back or just like dismiss it as something. It's to like to treat it as inherently something that should be censored and reproached, and that just has this amplification of it. It's like a Streisand effect almost in a way
Yeah.
of language that you don't like, and it's just like it's like an immune response. And no matter how
Yeah.
logical I am, it's not going to change how they engage with it. But it's like it's the opposite thing you should do psychologically to tell a bully to fuck off or have him to stop pointing something out you don't like. I
Yeah.
mean, the opposite of love is not hate; it's indifference, right? It's just
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Totally true. The opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. It's very well put. Yeah. I mean, it is a funny, I'm in this like, this totally ridiculous GC, group chat for those who don't know what that is. And the whole issue was, is that guy a hero or is he not a hero? Or no, no, not hero. Is he brave or is he not brave? The self-immolating guy. It's just
suicide
like
thing. Yeah,
God, what a ridiculous
yeah. I'm
topic.
I'm torn on this. That's the suicide question thing. I err towards cowardly.
Yeah.
But like, you know, like looking at it from the lens of like a Robin Williams, right? Or David Foster Wallace, or like these people with kids. I don't think actually Wallace had kids.
No, I
But
think he
like,
did. Yeah.
did he have kids? Oh, he did have
No,
kids. Yeah,
no,
you're
no,
right.
no. Did he? Did David Frost Wallace have kids?
I felt like he had a daughter, but I'm not sure actually. You should look that up.
Yeah.
But yeah, like if you have a kid and they're younger in some way, like then it kind of becomes to me an act of like intense selfishness, kind of. But
Absolutely.
yeah, like I'm talking about suicides of despair though. Like that's where I become much more like sympathetic, I guess, or just like understanding like the mental weight. Because I mean, I have had like depression at times, and I can kind of extrapolate what that must feel like and how persistently awful that must be. Like one of those pain, like one of those things where you have pain so common all the time, like the people just want to die. Um, but like self-emulation, like for a political message or something like that, like this is a little too maybe like autistic of a response, but if you want to move the needle on that, like stay alive. Like, I mean, again, maybe the message it sends is more powerful than an action, and in certain Eastern cultures, that's certainly the case. But I feel like in the West, it's not. It's kind of almost like a display. Whereas like when a you know with the images we've seen of like I forget the Indian name, those Indian guys who set themselves on fire, like then it sends like a serious message of some kind. So I don't know on that. But suicides of despair, I am much more sympathetic with. This kind of suicide, I'm more there's better ways to maybe get done what you want to get done, especially for in a Western context.
So how did you get out of depression?
Um,
Are
I don't
you
know
out? Are you out of it?
I know I'd say so. Like I'm not, and I would say I never had it to the extent of like someone who like a Robin Williams or something from what I kind of observed, but I've certainly had intense bouts of like like mental states where I can deeply sympathize with that and then extrapolate that being persistent for a long time. I some kind of like framing and contextualization. And I don't, and I actually did a piece on this. It's called devastating losses and what you get to keep. It's actually the only reason I'm in like DeFi right now is because I used to be pretty well off and I consider myself like semi-retired. And then I got wiped very hard in the bear market. And suicidal for losing money is, I mean, that's a very lower tier to me reason.
That's a
Kind of
lower
lame,
suicide.
honestly. Like, just hold on a bit, man. Like, it gets better. And it wasn't just that though, but it was like a accumulation of feelings and some other things externally that kind of had a confluence of creating that. And I tried to contextualize and frame it as like a part of a process that improved me in some way. And in hindsight, it really has. In fact, I'm much, much happier in my current situation and dynamic and getting to talk with you, like really talking with you, even having this podcast is an extension of that occurring to me because I would not have started writing. I would not have started putting out like thoughts and content and working in the space and meeting cool new people. It's like in hindsight, just spending my day managing my own money was deeply unsatisfying, kind of made me unhappy. And now I'm in Denver at a conference, like it's much more invigorating. So trying to frame it like viewing it kind of like a stock chart where there are vicissitudes and you can't liquidate yourself at a bottom. And I tried to view it from the lens of like a vicissitude and like just push through it and keep working out. If I ever stop working out, I'm probably on death's door. I'm probably going to kill myself soon. I kept working out through all that. And I think stuff like that probably helps. It definitely hormonally and kind of balance there too. So it never keeps me from going, deep. Um, anyway, kind of a rambling answer, but yeah, framing it, I think, is the big one.
So what does that mean exactly? Framing it. Like, what is that? Yeah, like say a little more about what framing it means.
Like contextualizing it in the broader cycles of life. So, for
Okay.
instance, like if you are, I mean, people always, and you see this even when like current thing dialogue and discourse and how there's something going
I
on
don't know
that's
why this happens, by the way. See, look, did you see that thing that just popped up? I
thumb
don't know
down.
why. And then I can never make it do it when I try to do it. It only does it when I don't. But anyway, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. And a lot of my analysis just in general gravitates toward this. So this is kind of just something innate in my temperament. Um, but viewing things in the process that no existence is up and to the right, and sometimes big events and like a stock chart. It really is it seems superficial, but life tends to follow that path too. Midlife crises and divorce events and things of that nature. So I try to contextualize things from a lens of like, where does this fit into a cycle that is typical, normal, or something I can pull out of? and try to, I think that's the most productive way to view it. Like, even if it is cope, some cope is productive. Like, some placebos are effective. Like, it's a lie, but it evokes the correct response. So, you know what? If the lie has utility and it gets you to be inspired and act a certain way, just always bear in mind, like, you can turn the lie into something genuine and with veracity if you act on it.
Wait, but what's
So,
the lie though? What do you mean? Sorry,
yeah, no,
I'm sorry,
there's
I'm pressing you so much. I'm just curious. I'm just curious.
the lie part was more the placebo thing, where something not true, but you believe it sincerely, actually evokes a response that's helpful.
Yeah,
And from what I'm describing, though, I didn't like lie to myself. I
yeah,
genuinely thought, like, hey, contextualize this. But I'm saying, like, I'm almost giving myself my own rejoinder here as a pessimist, saying that's cope. I'm like, well, what? Even if it is cope, it's useful cope that galvanized me to behave a certain way. So, like, I don't think it was, though. Like, I think it was. I think I was framing it correctly, but yeah, trying to just view it as something zoomed out. And everyone always focuses on, like, the week to week events and, like, oh my God, the biggest thing ever. But then, what, a month from now, no one cares anymore. No one cares. It's the next news cycle. They're moving on. And everyone has this huge fear of, like, an
yes.
event and getting criticized then. And I try to abstract that onto me. And, the framing, that's what I mean by framing.
I think that's well, I just love the word frame to describe it because I have been through one. I've only had one like suicidal type stretch in my life. And, I wasn't actually suicidal, but I was in that same mental state where you're saying where it was so bad, like my emotional state was so bad that it was like, wow, it would be way easier to just take this way out. You know what I mean? Than
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
like actually deal with this, right? But the cure, and I think the cure for everyone was a change in mentality, put very simply. I mean, and I think that's why the framing thing is so important. And I
Yep.
really think that I think it's like cured for good now. Like I don't think I'll ever go back there. I think that there's times when you feel bad, but I think that what that cliff is, particularly in men, I don't know about women, but
Mm.
I think that cliff in men is going from being a kid to being a man. And I think that going over that cliff, for me personally, it was having other people's expectations of me and following that and being really worried about other people's expectations of me and
Yeah.
then going to my like shifting
Yeah.
over to realizing that I didn't have to do anything that I didn't want to do. I could simply chase the dreams I wanted to have and be the person I wanted to be versus doing these things I was supposed to be doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That somehow I had decided, oh, well, if I signal this and do this, that will appease the eye in the sky, or that will appease the people around me, and they will then think I'm cool. And I think
Yeah.
that like there's great pain in going over that lip because when you're a kid and you're really hyper ambitious, that lip is like, you think, well, I'll never be like everybody else. I'll never be like these losers. Like, I'll never be like them. Like, I'm going to be a great person and I'm going to figure it out and blah, 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 blah. The problem is that's working against you because it's making you judge yourself by other people's metrics
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
your own, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that you see men, like I still see men who are older than me in tech, a lot of them in tech particularly, who clearly have not hit that wall yet. And they're
Yeah.
still
Yeah. Yeah.
scraping and they're still checking the boxes. And they're like, oh, no, I had my exit and I had my blah, blah, blah. And I have my hot girlfriend who looks a certain way. And you're like,
Yeah.
bro, like you are
Yeah.
headed for like you're headed for the wall, man, because that's not who anybody actually is, right? I mean, like,
Exactly. And yeah, I think that's a product too of men being innately hierarchical, and like that, what you just described is like a very traditionally manifesting, like, display of success.
yeah,
And a lot of guys, like, it's like when you engage on the enemy's framing or something, that's not quite applicable here, but it kind of is. You're engaging on framing that's not your own. It's not what you actually want. It's what you kind of are engineered to want because men are inherently more competitive. It's how you have more higher sexual market value. It's how you perceive success relative to other men. So I do feel that's like an innately like masculine way to probably get depressed when you don't succeed as well at that as you could, and then you view it as a failure. Men
Or
feel
you
failure
do
much more
succeed.
intensely.
Or you
Oh
do
yeah,
succeed.
and it's like where now, right?
Right,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
then you're like, oh, I got to this milestone. I thought girls were going to be throwing themselves at me, and I thought, oh, making this amount of money, that was gonna, then I would,
yeah,
be there. And then you're like, what happened?
yeah.
It's
And I
not
think the
there,
distinction there is like when you get your gratification from something external or internal, which it's very hard to err on the internal one. But when it's all external gratification, you think I've achieved this thing, and now these external things occur and it doesn't happen, or it's not as exciting, or it's not as stimulating after your initial flush. And then it's like, what next kind of thing. And yeah, I could see that impacting dudes a bit more. I also feel like if you suffer through an intense bout of depression that airs on like suicidal thinking or what have you, if you go through it again, it won't happen the same way.
right?
It won't, you won't get depressed for the same reasons. Like I think a lot of times the first time for men is like there's some self-pity there, and it really hits men that like no one else pities you though, man. Like people don't give a shit about guys being
Yeah,
sad. Like no
yeah,
one's gonna come hug you and help you. And it's like it's hurtful, but then like the ones who make it through that are much more mentally sound for it though. And then like if you get depressed again, midlife crisis, something like that, it's a different, it's like a different form, I feel, for men.
yeah.
And yeah, that come to Jesus moment where it's like, wow, like yeah, no one cares if you're sad.
Yeah,
Is a
nobody
big one for
really
dudes.
gives a shit about you at all, and
Mhm.
actually, the more sad you are, the less people give a shit. Yeah, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
and
It's
it's
like,
pitiable. It's like this guy's fuck, it's not like, oh, poor guy. It's like, oh, this guy's fucking self,
yeah,
uh yeah.
yeah, totally. So, how did you go from, did you have a kind of based awakening? It sounds like you had kind of a normie career and then you left that. Like, how did that go?
Yeah. So I was a journey. Like I grew up listening to it's funny, I've listened to God knows how many like debates and speech and what have you, but I've rarely read the books of the guys I like a lot. But like Hitchens, I grew up listening to all the time. And I've listened like probably every engagement speech. I really respect his articulation abilities and just his, like adroit debate and whatever. And I went through a cycle though of like kind of almost a cycle he did. He started off very liberal, and towards the end before he died, he started going to the right. And then Soul and all that. I've probably watched every single debate, firing line debate, Bill Buckley, that's on YouTube. That kind of discourse and dialogue was started to really reaffirm things. It also showed me that like none of this shit is new. Like truly none of it is new. If you
Yeah,
go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, all the debates, and those are like quality fucking debates. Like the liberals are saying the conservatives aren't thumping a Bible or anything. It's like, no, we're discussing things on like a reasonable ground, and it's good. Um, so that definitely like infused me with more of like I'm trying not, I'm not, I didn't grow up like purely on one lens of like reading any kind of political dialogue. um and then yeah, the discourse has gotten inherently worse and worse and worse since then. I mean, based off what I've observed from those things back in the day. And then kind of the Trump stuff is what really, because I was pretty centrist through then, like, and then you just start to see the very, very clear and apparent line that becomes more and more apparent in terms of messaging and how political enemies are treated. And then you begin realizing, wait, like these systems that are apparently fair seem to very explicitly not be fair. And that drives me like that's what pushes me from like right, reasonable, but I can see where the left's coming from and stuff to like, no, fuck you. Like this just seems to be where you almost have to pick a side because it's so polarizing. So my bait, I don't know. It was kind of very gradual. I was aware of the Soul, like the Thomas Sowell lectures and things like that for a bit. That definitely pushed me more and more right. I found Jordan Peterson, like around when he was teaching, like before Bill C-16, like the Canadian bill that kind of put him on the map where they were mandating like pronoun language. It's funny. His message back in the day was good. Like he's gone off the rails and just very normie core Ben Shapiro style, but he had a quality kind of assessment back in the day. So I kind of grew up on that and have become pushed more aggressively towards the right in a hierarchical way and like a very natural law kind of way. Which I mean, right now, I mean, the parties shift and all that right now, but right now, that clearly manifests to me more purely and correctly on the right, where the left just mandates fundamental dishonesty or smearing of language and certain degrees of science where they'll evangelize, and others though they'll completely like call a lie. It's just very transparently clear to me how their playbook at this point. And yeah, a bit of a process anyway. That's a long answer, but it's been an evolution and kind of how Trump was treated legally and how I saw things around the election, what have you,
Yeah.
kind of
So,
radicalized
I
even
mean,
further.
I think it's very interesting what you say about like going back and looking at some of these old debates and how exactly similar they are to what
Really,
we're
they are.
talking about today. And so like you'll be like, oh, they already talked about all this. Like this was already like we act like these things are like so new, but actually these issues have just been there forever, you know?
Yeah, that feeds into like probably the framing part of me too, where I go back and I see these cycles. I'm like, dude, like, and that informs me too about how none of this is ever solved. If it is
Yeah.
something to be solved, it's a perpetual like battle for homeostasis and like equilibrium that is a very much swims left thing over time because the discourse is like very much on the left's framing. Like the left dictates the framing, the right is completely at its whim. I mean, the leftism is just a dominant strategy I feel in wealthy nations. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's when I see a lot of this discourse too. I don't, I don't. It's just two moral foundations talking past each other. There's not a debate. Like it all presents as like factual discourse or here's my evidence and I'm duly informed here. And smart people with high verbal IQs just have more sediment of facts to get through to get down to just it's my moral selection. I
Yeah.
value sanctity and degradation, and you value fairness and cheating, like the John Haidt foundations. And that's just all it is. You have these two foundations just clashing each other. There's nothing to be rectified. And to me, what causes a leftward shift is an increase in wealth and an increase in the expression of leftist moral foundations, which become more useful, frankly, for wealthier nations over time. And they're better recruitment tools, like they're better loyalty generating tools. And I feel that's why the left continues to win. Um, anyway,
Well, until it bubbles over into communism.
yeah, well, yeah, and entropy. Yeah, I would view it as like entropic, just like disarray.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Because
we're
once
like
it goes there, yeah, sorry, no, keep going, keep going.
anyway, like I almost view communism as like a form of like I don't even know if I view that as leftism. That's like a form of like militant like fascism state. What to me, like when I say it swims left, it's like a removal. It's a continual eschewing of order-based moral foundations in favor of hedonistic ones
Yeah,
because you can't.
individualistic. Yeah.
Yeah. And a phrasing I had for this in like a series I wrote was called masculine because you have to and feminine because you get to. Like the moral foundations of the right tend to be inherently hierarchical, masculine, order instilling. And poor nations need that at their onset, right? Like you can't default to equality and distribution of stuff if you're at your genesis. So like poorer nations like need order definitionally, otherwise you will never succeed. So like the utility of conservative morals are much higher. And then as you get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, it becomes more and more of a luxury. And these luxury conditions beget luxury beliefs. And you get more and more of leftist type stuff. And as you get richer too, like leftist moral foundations have greater utility. I mean, you need to care about more distribution. Like the lower rungs of society don't have as much. You have very pronounced power laws. And it's kind of salutary in its own way to have an increased amount of leftist moral foundations that distribution, care, harm as you become more wealthy. But then you get so wealthy and so decadent, you completely disregard order. And then you have entropy. And it just, to me, that's what creates a cycle. I actually think wealth is causal because it makes men and people overall not see order as necessary. And the lack of order is definitionally entropic.
Are you a Robert Conquest guy? The Conquest Laws. Have you heard of these?
No. Who's that?
So Robert Conquest is a big like mold bug slash um Dave Green, the distributist. They talk about Robert Conquest. He was a right wing academic, I think, in the 80s. And he has these really great three laws that are kind of used to describe exactly what you're saying, which is the rot of institutions over time and how the laws go as follows. The first one is everybody is reactionary about what they know best. Second law is every institution not explicitly right wing will become left wing over time. And then the third law is the best way to understand an institution is to assume that it is run by a cabal of its enemies. And it's so
I never
random.
heard that
Like,
one.
like when you hear those laws, you really need, it took me like months to understand what he was talking about because they seem like, they're like, what do these have to do with each other? But what he's trying to express in these laws is, and by the way, I don't even think he wrote these laws. I think they were like recorded as something he used to say after the fact, which is even weirder. But I think what he's trying to unpack there, or articulate, is institutions are founded by a naturally, as you're saying, a right-wing person with right-wing values who understands one specific thing very, very well.
Right.
Over time, unless that is really explicitly, the rules are impenetrable and they are right-wing by their nature.
Right.
Leftism is just going to come in there because it's going to become a blood feast for people who don't care about the original thing as much as the founders, right? Like it's inevitably. And then finally that process is so reliable that looking at any given institution in its present, you can assume that it has been literally hollowed out and taken over by people that actually want to control it because they hate it, right? And if you look at what happened to like Yale or like Harvard, that's exactly what happened. Like it got totally flipped around.
Yeah, and those are good examples to illustrate that last point. That's interesting. Yeah, and I think that's part of like what maps onto fourth turning theory well too, is like these people that eventually come to own those institutions also don't care, like you said, they don't care about its founding, they weren't involved in it. Like we weren't there like when the UN was set up and whatever. So like we don't inherently view it as like this thing that's ours, I guess, in a way. And you just get this lack of like those who actually care and support it abdicating it, and then you get leeches coming in there and hollowing out, wearing a skin suit and just destroying it overall. And yeah, I think that maps on to of I mean, I'd love to know if there's a counterexample of this, because this feeds into my theory. Like, has there ever been like an extremely like wealthy, like fascist right wing like setup? Like, have there ever been like really opulent? Like, has there ever been a voting demographic where there's been a lot of wealth and they haven't been pretty leftwards and continuing to go leftwards? Like, and that kind of is part of this utility expression I see, where people's like, it's all about distributing the wealth, and it's all about, and that which is, creates an economic environment, which to me creates like almost an environment for genotypes to be expressed. I think this manifests at a very, very deep fucking level. And this creates like a political phenotype that becomes more and more prevalent. And I think wealth is ultimately causal for it. Because like, I don't know if there's examples of like very wealthy right wing kind of establishments or extremely poor, like leftist type things. I mean, Cuba, like communist, that's to me, like, I don't think that really counts. Like, they're not worried about they're not distributing money and like care about cultural left wing things, right? They're like actually really culturally very based in a way. So to me, that's like a manifestation still of like poverty, like morality, like that's still like to me a conservative tilting morality, just with a very like clamping down government. And that's why I think it's sort of inexorable. It's like a paradox of success. I don't think you can become a certain degree of wealthy and not have this permeate your society and eventually cause its decay.
It's so funny, right? It's like, God, I was just talking about this. It's like I grew up like I was a full-on wigger, as a kid. And so I grew up in a very like black and white community, right? And the black community was poor, the white community was rich. I was kind of like in between. I didn't come from money at all, but so I hung out with a lot of black kids. And what's so funny is where I'm from, Evanston, Illinois, is like the woke capital of America. It's the only place that has reparations. It has like BLM lawn signs on every yard. It was the foundation of like the temperance movement. It has been like the woke annoying city forever. It's where Northwestern is. And you would think like the way that the media would make us think is that like, oh, there's a lot of like, there's like it's very left wing because it's black and white. But actually, the black community there, as you're saying, is very impoverished, but they're extremely right wing as people. You know what I mean? Like, like they're not sitting around like talking about communism. I mean, they're sitting around talking about getting money. Like we hate gay people. Like like they're totally right. They're extremely right wing. If they were white, they would be like complete Nazi. Like total right wing fascists. But
Right,
since
right.
they're black, they're like viewed by the wealthy white population, who, as you're saying, is like these crumbling into leftism.
Mhm.
They're, they're viewed as like, oh, well, they're our friends, when really the black population is just trying to survive. So they're like, yeah, okay, we'll take your donations. We'll
Right.
vote for you and take your donations so we can get money and give it to our people.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's like a Paris. It's like a this. It's almost like a pay for vote scheme in a way,
Yeah.
where and they keep them very at arm's length too. Like there's this huge segregation,
Yeah. Oh,
unofficial one of like
yes.
where they live. Like they'll espouse like it's like the Will Stancil type guy, right? Like he'll say all these great things. He lives like the whitest part of America and like
Yeah.
the whitest suburb of it. It's like we know what you think. Like I don't care what you say. Like your
Right.
actions express what you actually understand about the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't feel like it's just a manifest luxury belief. Like you can only have luxury beliefs, like which leftism trends to, in luxury environments. I mean, it's almost definitional to me, which means an excess of like opulence produces like leftism by design. So long as you have like a voting structure where that can be rewarded and manifest. Like the Saudis are pretty wealthy, but like they clamp the fuck down on what you can and can't do. Right? They're not like an actual. They're just a monarchy. But
Well,
even they are kind of moving left on some stuff too.
yeah.
Interestingly, but anyway,
That's
yeah,
kind
go
of
ahead.
a good counterexample, though, the Saudis, right? Like, how did they stay so incredibly right wing? Because they are, right?
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of two things there. One, they're not democratic at all. They don't even pretend to be. So like, there's just this overarching. I mean, top down, like what China does. I mean, China's getting richer, and I don't know if it's necessarily getting more liberal. I'm actually not sure about China. But like the cultural influence there, which is also reinforced by an intense religious undertone, like intense, intense, intense. And the religious undertones of Islam are insanely order, conservative moral foundations, like in terms of sanctity, degradation, and, things like that. So I think if you have that as an underpinning, it can counteract these two conflicts. And right now, I mean, the religious underpinning of the Saudis is stronger. But if they allow more expression of the populace to vote and start giving them more, like if they have like luxuries of common things, like I feel that would be inexorable that they would move that way. I would even imagine that eventually Islam would fade and lose to that over time because people ultimately believe in like the things that give them comforts and whatever. Like I don't think they have a deep ingrained belief that will cause them to always adhere to Islam in like a radical way. If allowed to express it like from leadership, I would expect them to probably head the way of the West eventually. I would
I
think any
think you're
nation would.
probably right about yeah. I think you're right about that. I mean, you already kind of get that sense. Like you already sort of kind of see, like it does seem like they're like right. Like it seems like that. Well, I mean, it kind of goes back to the thing. It's like, yeah, they have these laws that are really, really deeply entrenched in right wing, and that's why they've been able to thrive in this environment.
Hmm.
But at the same time, their leaders are getting more and more decadent. The things they're doing are getting more and more attention and outward stuff. And
Hmm.
you start to see it. It's like it's just a matter of time. It's a matter
Yeah,
of
yeah.
time before
And I think they're
Saudis.
probably
Yeah.
they're probably paying for that compliance too, because it's like an open secret in Saudis that like you get a government job and like huge amounts of like nepotism, whatever there, and you literally just sit in the desk and do nothing all day. Like I've heard many, many anecdotes that like their bureaucratic state puts ours to shame in terms
Really?
of just like you get a job and you're just paid and you do nothing. So like if you are paying people like that, you're paying them for loyalty then basically at this
Yeah.
point. So you can keep top down, maybe three or four, however many guys in the kingdom mandating stuff. You can get people to kind of subside to that. But I think if you pull out that like, just free money standpoint, yeah, I think you'll start to see the populace trend a certain direction. So it's like you can get compliance, but you got to go out of your way to manufacture with like money or political power they wouldn't otherwise have. Um, and to me, those are almost inherently like leftist like game theory anyway, in terms of like how they win elections and what they do. Like they promise higher payouts, they promise more money, they promise political power to people who otherwise would have none without the state. Like it's almost like they're manifesting leftist like game theory styles of controlling like loyalty within a structure so they can keep being based religious kind of Islam. I feel if they pulled that out, it would probably change. Yeah, it's just
That's
a guess though.
interesting. It's like paid loyalty on a mass scale, and that's what everybody has to do. Like there's this artist that she's actually very base and she's cool. But she was, like, what do they say about a girl who starts posting pictures from Saudi Arabia? Like they're being like sex trafficked over there. You know what I mean?
Oh,
But this girl who would never in a million years do that, and who is very like, she's a great artist here. She started posting pictures from Saudi Arabia the other day, and I was like, that's funny. Like, I've never seen this. I was like, I've never seen these like parts of Saudi Arabia. Nobody ever shows pictures of these things. And it
yeah.
does see, and this is like, a female artist in LA. And I was like, wow, it does kind of feel like they're definitely like gonna start, especially as we get so rotten, like
Right.
they're going to just get more and more desirable to go over there, and it's just going to be more and more attractive, and the more people start flooding in there, the weaker and weaker they're going to get.
Exactly. Like the ones are like they see the decay, they're going to go there. But even if you're like based here, you're probably not that based in Saudi Arabia. So you're
Yeah,
going to move the Overton window a little bit, creep, creep, creep,
yeah,
and yeah. The U.S. will eventually like it's expats will take a lot of the beliefs and mindsets with them, even if they are more right wing here. That's like at best probably centrist in like an Islamist country.
yeah.
So
The
yeah.
Californication of Saudi Arabia. We need somebody to write this article like right now. It's a great. All right. So you are a DeFi guy.
Mhm.
So give us a little intro to DeFi and like what you're working on.
So and I like DeFi very intentionally and not like cryptocurrency. I really actually hate that term. I've written a piece on that too.
Dude,
Um,
I am hearing this so much recently.
are you
Crypto has
good? Good.
become so rotten as a term. Everybody's like, I am not a crypto guy. They're like, I'm a Bitcoin person, but I am absolutely not a crypto guy, which I get. I get that
Yeah,
argument.
yeah.
I know what that means. And it's a good one. Like,
Qualification there though, it's not because of a connotation. It's actually explicitly on the word currency. My umbrage is that's explicitly because very very little of this space is trying to actually create currencies. And when guys who don't come from a finance background or who don't look deep into it hear that, they just think tokens bouncing around, which is just like, well, why is that one more than that one? Like, whatever. Like, you might not even be against it, but you're not necessarily for it or curious about it. Like, this is just tokens bouncing around that you just make in a computer, so whatever. Like 95% of it is not currency. And that's actually why I hate the word cryptocurrency. I'd much prefer crypto. DeFi I like because decentralized finance connotes infrastructure. Like it's a new paradigm for commerce is the right way to me to put it. Like people are building ways for someone to transact with someone else that disintermediates the state, banks, basically an intermediary. It doesn't even have to be a political one. It can just be, the same thing of like if you want to hail a ride on Uber, right now Uber provides a very serious service and that they're the intermediary. I tell Uber gets the driver, they send him to me. But if I can just connect directly to the driver and he comes gets me, that's good. The more things you disintermediate out of a supply chain, the more value accrues to the two parties transacting in it. And that is at its core like the economic proposition of DeFi. Like you are removing a lot of the entities that were previously necessary. Like I'm not calling them parasitic. Like banks were necessary, regulations were necessary, right? These are things that we've created for a reason. There's a reason why society has them to create these systems. What DeFi does fundamentally is it removes a lot, or it obviates a lot of the necessities that regulators and banks and all the lawyers you had to hire to do stuff in the compliance department, all that. Like it just lets you act and transact. And there are still laws, like there are still rules, but they're codified publicly on chain, and you can see those rules. And that's what enforces it. Code and a system that like algorithmically produces outputs that makes you transact with each other. So on a small like little tangent too, that there's a great piece. I wish I could take credit for this called Hardness. Or it touched on the concept of hardness by an Ethereum dev wrote it called Josh Stark, I believe, where he describes like all these regulations, these lawyers, et cetera, the banks, all this. What this does is it lets you transact and expect something in the future. It makes the future more reliable in certain ways. So I know if I enter into a contract with you, there's an enforcement mechanism if you lie to me or if you try to steal from me. If I wire money from bank A to bank B, I know there are legal things set up and state enforced things that I can trust, reasonably so, that these things will happen. So, like, this whole system is built so humans can reliably behave and navigate the world and say, this will likely happen because these systems are in place. So that's the purpose they fulfill. And we are providing hardness on chain. Blockchains provide hardness, but algorithmically and with code. And so we're just taking those things and you could view bankers as JavaScript running really, really, really slowly. And we're now putting this on chain, and it works much more quickly, much more efficiently. It'll only get much more efficient too. So that's like at its core what the kind of ecosystem is. Does that make sense before I move on? Like, you have questions on it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it definitely makes sense. I think you're just saying, put extremely simply, that the monetary system has a million infrastructural touch points in it simply because it has to, because things move so quickly. We have to have laws that will enforce certain parts of it. We have to have banks that will, forward the money, and they have to be extremely reliable, right? These banks have
Right.
to be like rock solid. And that requires all kinds of infrastructural mucking about.
Right.
And ultimately that's extremely inefficient. And so if you can knock the crypt, a blockchain, I guess, right, has given us the ability to automate a lot of those infrastructural points. Is that right?
Exactly. Exactly
Yeah.
right. Yes. And so it's not issuing that order and structure. It's codifying it publicly and transparently on chain.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So that's like the core. But and that's what when I didn't like I was loosely like in crypto, like 2014 or 13 or so, but I thought it was just cryptocurrency. That's what the currency meme got me. It's like, well, this is cool, but whatever. And then when I learned about the infrastructure, it's like, oh shit, because I'm innately just like a tech guy, I'm more of a tech investor. And when I saw that there's like businesses being built here in a serious way, then it like really like it's like, okay, I'm really curious about this now. And also like on the side, this is why, and I write about this too on something called the Vietnam thesis, why the state hostility to me makes, I mean, it is completely rational and sensible that they hate us. They should hate us. I would hate us too. So I'm not saying like sympathize with the enemy, but empathize. Like, I want you to pretend you're these the U.S. exerts its soft power through the financial rules and the financial system, its tax collection, its sanctions, its dollar diplomacy, all that. When these guys start realizing, oh shit, wait, now our sanctions don't mean anything. Swift taking Russia out of the Swift system, they just do it on. Holy shit, we fucking hate this. This is now they can put up whatever smokescreen we want about equality, it hurts the environment, what, like fuck off. Like that is just pick it out of a hat. That's the thing they're putting out there, and that's why to me it is absolutely like a futile thing where you see a lot of these crypto guys be like, we have to lobby and convince our senators, and like the machine will always hate you. You only detract from their power, only. And like framing this in the industrial revolution's kind of set up, like every industrial revolution before ours, like the second, third, et cetera, has been accretive and beneficial to the state and to people. It's helped both parties, right? Like the technology's made things more efficient and it's made countries more economically prosperous. The fourth industrial revolution, which you could say is like Web3, which is DeFi and like decentralized compute and finance. It's the first industrial revolution that has decremented state power by design. It disintermediates these things out of supply chain. So then I would ask these crypto guys who are political, like, by design, we remove these people from the supply chains. Why are you surprised they hate us? Like, why are you surprised that like this is like some kind of lobbying effort? Like, no, like there is a clash of odds here to where the state will never like what we are building. And near term, I'm kind of, I don't want to say blackpilled about it, but I just understand what the adversary thinks about us, and I'm not like disillusioned, I feel. But longer term, for the same reason that like Pirate Bay still exists, and a lot of these peer-to-peer networks where like they hate them, but you can't really stop them. Mapping this onto wars in the past, like the U.S. military is built to go after very large centralized entities like the USSR, China, Germany, Japan, right? And we beat those. We're very good at war with that kind of stuff. But who does the U.S. lose to recently? Loses to
Yeah.
fucking Vietnam,
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Guerrilla warfare is where you can't identify the enemy and it's very difficult to conduct warfare on that grounds. That's fourth generation warfare. And that is, to me, I map this now onto like the war here with like regulators. The SEC, like the US military, is built to go after Deutsche Bank, Barclays, Goldman Sachs. Where's your compliance department? Can I speak to your CEO? Like very organized and structured. I know how to attack you. DeFi, it's like you have a globally distributed network armed with cryptography and very well capitalized across the globe. Like they're not built to stop that. No regulator is. So that's why it's like near term, it's going to suck, but long term, the victory is inevitable. It's a superior economic framework. And also, you just can't fucking stop it. Like you'd have to go so draconian, locking down the internet, making you register computers, like GPUs being like illegal. Like you'd have to like truly go insane, like full China and then some. And then at that point, you just have the talent's going to leave the U.S. I would leave easily if that happens. I'll go to El Salvador, places where other nations will be accommodating to that. And that's why, to me, the game theory speaks like DeFi absolutely wins on multiple levels. The US can't stop it, though it's fully rational for it to hate it, for it to hate us. And yeah, that's kind of like my macro viewpoint of it all. And
But why can't they just get into the game and control? Like, if again, maybe this is completely the wrong interpretation, but I'm imagining that the substrate of all of this is a blockchain. There at some level, it's a blockchain, right? So
like we I mean, all a blockchain is a decentralized database. So, like right now, the databases are owned by the banks, by the governments, and they can go right. They can say, "Hey, freeze this guy's account right fucking now,"
yeah,
Canadian trucker style, right? You can do that with one database, but with a database that's distributed and has this like consensus of what truth is, you can't do it. Like you'd
yeah,
have to do some like serious CIA tier hardcore fuckery. You can't do it in the regulatory framework that you can typically do it. And that's why that fundamentally disintermediates their power, because they can't freeze things and they can't stop people from sending money to each other.
yeah. So, but okay. So I hear what you're saying. I guess what I'm saying is, imagining that there has to be some technology, whatever this technology is, that is allowing this DeFi possibility to even be realistic at all. And it's blockchains and it's all, I mean, the way that I have always looked at Bitcoin, the way that I explain it as simply as possible is very simple, which is never before in the digital world has scarcity been possible, right? There is no way to enforce scarcity in the digital world.
Yeah.
And then the blockchain makes that possible, right? It makes it so that there can be one of something in the digital world, whereas that was never possible before.
Sure.
So saying that I don't know if this is really the real reason. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get to is this network, whatever it is, this substrate of blockchains and Bitcoins and DeFi. Why can't the establishment simply get in the game? You know, why can't they get in the gold rush, right? Why can't Goldman Sachs, and I know they are doing this, but why can't the Chase blockchain just be the best? That's the one that's the best one. And then we're all screwed, right?
Yeah. Well, they can't, like, fundamentally, you can see that if you want to frame it in this way, and it's actually not even much of a stretch, like they already run their own blockchain. Like it's one node and one validator, and it's called your own database. Like using blockchain terminology, that's what that means. So that's why when I say like a centralized database, that's like what a server is, basically. It's a ledger. And that's what a blockchain is, by the way. It's just a ledger that codifies ownership. So if I use Venmo and I send you money, like my account goes down, your account goes up, and all that happens on the back end is the server at whatever bank that's held at just updates a ledger.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that is at its core a single node validator blockchain.
Right.
Right. So
and a blockchain is everyone owns the ledger, right?
exactly. Yeah.
And can see it.
Yeah. Well, more importantly, a very distributed consensus mechanism determines the validity of who owns what. So no single entity can clamp that down and freeze something or take away. So I fully expect there to be many blockchains. All a blockchain is what's called like a layer one. Like Bitcoin has its own blockchain, Ethereum has its own blockchain. There will be a lot of them. There will be ones, and there already are. There are ones with like lower validator sets that are more efficient and cheaper, but they're more centralized. There are ones that are very distributed and decentralized, like Ethereum or Bitcoin. The more decentralized you get, the harder it is to censor, but also the slightly less efficient against too. It's an unavoidable engineering trade-off, but it makes it more robust. So you will definitely have banks with like, they're branded as blockchain, but it's just their own database. You also have federal governments with that too. You'll probably have CBDCs, which just makes US dollars programmable. You really already have functionally CBDCs already with how dollars exist. Like to me, those are things that are obviously not good, but things are already really bad and controlled by them. Like it's like a small degree of worse. It's already fucking bad. Like, they can already clamp down. They already own all the financial rails. So there will be many of them, but like the ones people use, or a lot of us will use, would be the ones increasingly that, they won't like the ones that the state can't control. And they absolutely can get on it from an economic standpoint, which is your framing. Like if they want to buy a fuck ton of Bitcoin or ETH or whatever, like in Goldman and all these ETFs, they're doing it too right now. But my framing is getting on control, is on soft power, because I don't care how wealthy you get. The U.S. is already incredibly wealthy. Losing that infrastructure and those rails is what's very, very important. It's how they've exerted their influence really since World War II, since they dominated and owned the infrastructure, since Bretton Woods Agreement and all that, right? And how they enforce their beliefs and policies globally is through the network they created, and they won from winning a war.
Yeah.
And I'd hate losing that too, man. Like it's not nice. I agree. Like I empathize with them on that standpoint. I'm still happy to take it from them, but like that's where it's like a power framework sort of thing that it's just an unavoidable that they're going to hate us. Well, certain states will hate us. I think the West collectively, the U.S. and its vassals, but other poorer countries, I think we'll see the arbitrage opportunity as you already are. You're seeing it in El Salvador, and it'll try to attract the building of this, what have you. And the US can't shut down all the validators. They can't go after everybody. They can set up their own validators too and maybe try to contribute to the network and maybe disrupt it a bit, but you're not going to own it. You're not going to be able to. I really doubt that you would be able to disrupt the network that way. But you'd have to do that's like NSA tier shit. That's not like law. Stop doing this tier stuff. That's like subterfuge CIA level stuff of like, all right, we want to upend this stuff, but in the shadows. Maybe an an economically irrational actor might be able to fuck with things a lot, like the state, like the CIA. But that's a degree of what you'd have to do to maybe disrupt stuff. Anyway, I don't want to tangent too much, but
So what was Bretton Woods?
Bretton
I've
Woods.
heard this obviously, but I don't actually know what it is. I've heard
Yeah. It's the agreement that happened right after World War II. In fact, it went on right before the war ended, I believe, that codified that the U.S. would basically be the world's reserve currency, and that it would be backed by gold. And it essentially set up the U.S. to sort of become, have a very strong control of the financial networking system, essentially. And being the reserve currency it has a lot of pros. Like it basically allows us to export our dollars as an export. I choose that word intentionally, like it allows us to have the trade deficits that we have, which are not as bad, if at all, that people let on. I actually think there's a lot of confusion on what a trade deficit means. But it gave us a lot of luxuries that allowed the dollar to basically underpin economic, like a lot of financial activity. But I also feel it's also been kind of a little bit of a facade with the backing of the gold, because the euro dollar system. I won't get too in the weeds on this, but like I don't think it's possible to have a reserve currency or a currency everyone uses it's backed by like a physical substance or something that doesn't allow it to make more. Like the Bitcoin 21 million cap. If Bitcoin wants to be like the global currency, you can't have that cap. I fundamentally don't think that's possible, and that's why markets like the euro dollar market came into existence, which basically was offshore dollars that banks just kept lending to. They just created dollars. Banks print money, like fundamentally. Banks are the ones that make money. It's not the Fed. They're banks. Banks make about 97% of the money that exists in reality come from banks like creating loans out of nothing. So anyway,
but they're
Bretton
not
Woods is
actually
basically
printing dollars. They're just putting it on a ledger. They're putting the dollars on a ledger, right?
I mean, they're not physically making like the
They're not
Fed
physically printing.
makes physical currency. So physical currency does come from the government, but banks print money by literally just marking up
They
accounts with
mark it in the
buttons.
ledger, right? They say
Literally
you
that.
owe this now. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That there's no such thing as like they're not like uh, converting what's that maturity arbitrage where like they're lending out fractional reserve lending. It's not a thing, and it's not a thing like objectively. Like the reserve requirement in the U.S. is zero. The reserve requirement in the UK is zero. In New Zealand it's zero. And Hong Kong it's zero. I actually did a piece I wrote up recently. There's like 7 or 8 major countries. In Sweden it's zero. There's no reserve requirement against these loans, right? So it's like you're not fractionally lending out anything. There's certain assets that keep it in check, but banks literally just fucking congeal it out of the ether. Like the bank, like people hate. And I do a very in-depth series on this for anyone who's a little curious about this, because I know this will have a based audience. You're probably going to think, oh, money printing is fine. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying you hate the wrong thing with the Federal Reserve. It's an impotent, feckless institution that does nothing of the things it claims to do. And I get like autistically literal in a lot of this stuff when I dive into it. And at its core, though, like the increase of money supply is coming from banks. Again, 97% of currency that exists in the real world. And in the real world, I mean money that consumes resources, because people will see QE and they'll see this huge change in the M2 chart. It's not money that ever touches reality. It's money that exists literally on like back end Fed computers that never goes out and buys things. Printing is when money is created in reality that fucking takes resources. Then inflation goes up, and that's what we hate, right? We saw a huge uptick in inflation in 2020 because the fiscal side, fiscal meaning the government spending, monetary meaning the Fed, right? Fiscal spending happened where we airdrop people money, You got inflation. The Fed's been doing this QE shit since 2008. Japan's been doing QE since 2001. There has been zero inflation in Japan in the last 20 years. I mean, like zero to fucking negative. Their stock market has been sideways forever. So, like, it doesn't cause this asset price inflation and this kind of money, whatever, that the optics would have you believe. It's all coming from the fiscal side when it spends money and from banks. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. The Bretton Woods
No,
thing,
no,
though,
no. I
is
love what you're saying because it's this whole fuck the Fed thing has always like slightly, I've always been like a little bit like, I don't really get it. So I'm actually really glad that you're saying this because I'm like trying to
it's a
understand.
false god. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
you know
kind
what?
of a
It's the most.
false god.
It's the most. To me, it's one of the most pronounced examples of horseshoe theory is the Fed, because the neoliberal side will say it's all powerful, that's a good thing, and the Austrian right side will say it's all powerful, that's a bad thing. But they both fucking think it's God. Like they both like there is not a single modicum of doubt on anything that comes out of that institution, on what they do and how powerful they are, in their ability to exert control over a complex adaptive system, which is the economy. It's very, very analogous to if there was a federal Department of Weather saying we're pricing in we want it's going to get hotter in the next month or so, and thinking, well, the wind and suns are going to price us in now, and whatever, they're front running they're listening to the Department of Weather. It doesn't control it. Like when you look at the mechanics of how it claims to do what things it does, again, I can't emphasize this enough. I really go into detail for guys who want to get like technical, like, no, you don't. Like, it's not there, including the interest rate thing. It's not controlled by that institution. It is a lagging indicator. Interest rates are fundamentally an output of GDP growth and inflation. That's just empirically so. I put together charts that like literally stack on these two things and then show an interest rate, and it just tracks it. And the Federal Reserve is not controlling GDP growth and inflation with buttons. I would hope even the most based of Austrian guy would be like, yeah, no, obviously the Fed just doesn't press buttons and make the economy do something. It's an output of those things. It's an output of a complex adaptive system. And the Fed controls one overnight rate,
That's it.
and that's fucking it. And it does
Yeah.
not change the 10-year bond, the 30-year bond, the 7-year, all these things that banks use to lend on.
Yeah.
They lend on economic reality of what they can get value from, right? Like that.
But
They're
if
if
they
they're
have
making
no backstop, if the banks have no backstop at all, you're saying there's zero reserve, right? And again, I'm not a finance guy. I'm like trying to keep up here. So when you're saying that the zero reserve, I assume what you mean by zero reserve is that the banks don't, either you're saying the Fed has no actual minimum amount that it has to have in it, and then the banks are getting, they're issuing their own loans. And okay, so explain to me what zero reserve means.
Right. That's a good question.
Zero.
So when I say zero reserve requirement, that's what I'm saying. So, and what that means is what's taught in like economics textbooks in schools is that banks do fractional reserve lending. Right. It's a very known statement. What that means is I have $1,000 in my bank, and I'm going to lend out 10,000. So what that would be the bank doing fractional zone of a 10% reserve, right, of 1,000, but they lent out 10K. Okay, so in a textbook, in a concept, that's fractional reserve lending. That's what banks do. Banks just will it out of the air. Now, some do have reserve requirements where it's like you have to hold 2, 3, 4, 5%. But right now, that reserve requirement is zero. It's been zero in the U.S. since 2020. It's been zero on and off.
Wait, but is it a reserve inside the private bank or inside the Fed?
Well, banks hold it at an account at the Fed. So it's an account the bank owns, but it's housed at their regional Federal Reserve Bank. So
I see. So they don't have to have any actual money inside the Fed. That's what you're saying. There's a 0% mandatory amount that they have to have
for purposes of making a loan. There is no reserve requirement that's underpinning that. There is a constraint now on their ability to lend, because you might say, well, what's stopping the bank from issuing $1 trillion loan?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they're what's called capital adequacy ratios, which means like the assets the bank has. So there's an important distinction here too, because when a bank borrows in the Federal Reserve market, they have an asset they borrow, but they also have a liability because they owe the money back. So from a balance sheet standpoint, it's nil. Okay. Capital adequacy ratios mean you have to have a certain amount of assets to lend against.
Yeah.
So you can borrow as much money in reserve market, which is the market the Fed controls, but it doesn't do anything for your capital ratio. It does nothing. I can borrow $1 trillion in that market, but now I have $1 trillion debt I owe. Yeah. Assets nil.
So you have no more in your capital ratio thing, but you have 1 million houses in Florida that you have mortgages on. And those are
when the Fed does its QE game, it only fucks with reserves. And it's like reserve, like it's only fucking with banking reserves. And these reserves are not constraining any economic activity from the banks. In fact, and I have charts in this too, like lending from banks collectively has been trending down since all this QE stuff has been happening. It's not galvanizing the banks to make loans because banks only make loans if there's an economic rationale for them to do so. It's in their interest, they're going to make money. So the Fed floods the market with reserves and everyone loses their mind. But these reserves don't constrain any lending. They don't encourage the bank to lend more. And when I emphasize that, because these reserves, remember, they sit at the Fed. They're still held at the Fed. I want you to envision like an account at the Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed can mark those up $20 trillion, but if it's not out in the real world buying things, who fucking cares? Right? If you want to give me, $1 billion, but I can never spend it and I can't lend against it, and I just look at it all day, am I really a billionaire? Like, what does that money do for me? Like
Yeah.
these reserves just sit there, so they aren't lent out, and they don't constrain or they don't let the bank lend more.
We're talking just hold on. We're talking about the money. Are we talking about the loans that the Fed has out to the banks right now?
So when I say reserves, like
Yeah.
in the QE stuff, when that happens, what the Fed does is it puts reserves on the bank's balance sheet and it takes their bonds. So the bank
It puts
has
it. Well, you just like it puts the reserve. It does what?
so like quantitative easing, the thing that makes like everyone lose their minds. So banks have say X amount of treasury bonds on their balance sheet, right? Say they have $1 billion. The Fed says, okay, we're doing a QE now. Give us those $1 billion of bonds or 500 million. Here's $1 billion in cash reserves. Now the bank has the same amount of assets there. I want to emphasize that net amount of assets in the world are the same. Everything the Fed does when it puts something out into the world, it kills something every single time. The net amount, the Fed can't make new assets. Like it's always a swap. It's a massive swapping machine that takes one thing and puts another thing there of commensurate value. So and when it does that, it puts reserves on the bank's balance sheet, right? And everyone loses their mind, like holy shit, money printing. But that money
But
stays
hold on,
there.
it's putting reserves on the bank's balance sheet. What do you mean?
Cash.
What is a reserve?
It's cash held at the Federal Reserve. The cash the bank
Cash
holds.
held by the Federal Reserve. It's
Cash the
okay.
bank holds at the Federal Reserve.
Okay, got it. So it's swapping out the bonds held by the bank, and it's liquefying them into cash, and it's saying, bank, you used to have these bonds, now you have that amount of money in cash held at the Federal Reserve.
Right.
Okay,
That's all it's doing. I want you to envision too, like if I was doing this to you, like Isaac, you have a $10,000 savings account. Now you have a $10,000 checking account. How much wealth, how much did that limit you before? That really, are you going to go spend like, holy shit, it's in my checking account now.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm big money. It's the same logistical.
So then,
shift.
where does the Fed rate come in with that?
So that's a great question. So you'll notice when the Fed does this QE stuff, it also lowers rates. And it's always, by the way, following rates that are already going down. You might also notice that too. Like they're already heading down, but that's like, all right, we're lowering rates now. We're doing the thing that's already happening. The economy's, creating. So the Fed controls what's called the federal funds rate, which is an overnight rate for borrowing in the interbank bank reserve market. It's like when banks lend each other's reserves. It's all that rate is. It's an overnight rate for lending reserves to each other. So in order to make that rate be what it wants, it needs a certain amount of reserves in the system, right? Because there's a lot of reserves, that means there's plentiful. That means the rate will probably go down, right? Because it's easier to get them.
Yep.
And when it wants to tighten and raise rates, it sucks those reserves out, and now reserves aren't as plentiful, and now the overnight rate goes up. So,
but that rate is not for the bank's loans to the that rate is not for the Fed's loans to the banks. It's for the bank's loans to each other.
That's correct. It's how it's banks borrowing overnight between each other to like fulfill obligations, whatever that they may need to do, payments.
I did not even know that at all. I thought that it was just the amount they were lending to banks, but it's not. It's the banks it's the amount that they basically charge the private banks to move reserves that they hold from each other. That's what that rate is.
Emphasis is the rate that banks charge each other. It's not a rate the Fed directly controls. They set a range for it, and they encourage this range, this overnight rate between banks, by putting more reserves in or taking some reserves out, and by offering sometimes some economic incentives.
So that's not a rule. When we say the Fed rate, right? When we say the Fed rate, that's a range that they're basically advising the private banks, you guys have to lend in this range.
It's exactly correct.
God,
It's a
I
range
had
we'd like you to
no
lend
idea that that's what the Fed rate was. I had no clue. I thought that the Fed rate
in.
was just a very simple, this is your interest rate. Here's your, here's your loan. I didn't realize that it was between them, which actually makes so much more sense now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And
Wow. Wow.
yeah.
Fast.
And the
Fascinating.
logic, by the way, for that rate, because again, that almost seems trivial now. Like, why the hell is that rate this godly rate? And the
Yeah.
Fed has other means of like massaging that rate in range. It's pretty good at keeping the rate in range. Like I'll give credit where it's due. The Fed basically does control the Fed funds rate, albeit indirectly. It does not dictate what
It
that
doesn't say
interbank
it
rate
has
is.
to be, but it is. It's like a
Exactly.
consensus
It'll
thing.
it'll structure stuff in a way where it doesn't make a lot of economic sense for the banks to go outside of range. So the banks like whatever. And frankly, it's not like it's this adversarial relationship. There's a notion called moral suasion, where basically the Fed also has meetings with the banks, say, hey, we'd like you to do it around this range, and the bank's like, okay, like it's not like this battle going on between the banks and the Fed. So they're mostly like they'll work with each other, and the Fed economically incentivizes it to stay in range. So the Fed does basically control the rate that banks lend between each other. Now you might say, like, why the fuck do I give a shit about that in the real world? Why does that impact like what Joe Schmo does if he wants to borrow to build a factory and economic stuff, right? The logic purely for this is that if you change like this lower tier rate, then because bond like rates follow what's known as a yield curve, and a yield curve should be upward sloping typically. So the longer rates go out in length, the more risk traditionally associated with them, which means you demand a higher rate. And usually, like treasuries follow this distribution typically, and real economic borrowing follows this distribution. So if we change this rate, that means the rate after that should change, and the rate after that should change. And like ergo, we control the 7-year and the 10-year and 20-year bond with this interbank lending rate. Like, let me be clear, that is pure, that is the most academic theory selling alive. And it makes beautiful sense on paper that like a 10-year bond is just a series of 10 1-year forward rates of a 1-year bond. Like that would get you an A plus on an econ test. Okay, but these things, you can look at the yield curve right now. It's been inverted for quite a long time, even while the Fed was shrieking, we're raising, we're raising, we're raising. It's been sideways forever. Rates went up. I did a piece on this too, where rates went up very dramatically over 2020, while the Fed said no rate increases for years and years. We're not raising rates till 2024. And rates kept creeping up and up and up because these encapsulate inflation and GDP growth. They don't fundamentally fucking care what this overnight rate is because they encapsulate economic reality. So you have this academic theory that's taught by universally every single finance department in the planet, and everyone at the Fed treats it like gospel. And it's a religious precept, though, fundamentally, because if you look at economic reality, these rates don't follow it. Like they aren't dictated by it. They don't control the 10-year bond and the things that actually dictate economic reality, because these US Treasury bonds are what banks and other entities reference as a risk-free rate for the loans they make. If I can get a 10-year bond
Because
that's risk-free for 3%.
that's
Anyway,
where
sorry.
that
Yeah.
number that what were you calling it? The like EA, what was it? The ratio of loans to assets?
Capital adequacy ratio.
Yeah, capital adequacy ratio. That's what the bonds are being tied. The bonds are a part of that.
Yes. So the bonds on the bank's balance sheet, that's good collateral that a bank can lend against.
And that's
Just
what
like
they care about. And
yeah, and for economic reality, like you care about what the 10-year treasury should be as say a bank, because why would I lend, or like say the 30-year treasury bond? Why would I make a loan to John who wants to buy a home? He's riskier than the federal government. And if
right.
I can get a 6-year interest rate on the 30-year bond, well, then I should charge him. That's called a spread. I should charge him 7, 8, 9%, et cetera.
Got it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I see. But you're saying that actually the Fed rate doesn't impact the bond rates, even though theoretically it's supposed to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Like
yeah, yeah.
theoretically, they should press a button and then like,
And
oh,
this should
everything.
go here. So
Yeah,
wait, can
yeah.
you just explain how does the bond part of it work? So what is the bond yield curve again? Of course, I've heard this a million times. I know what inversion, I theoretically kind of understand what inversion is, but explain how the bond side of this works.
So like, and I did a piece on this too. And I think this is a great way to conceptualize yield curves and why rates matter and what they represent. So are you familiar with the concept of futures? Like if you wanted to buy corn and corn like oil, right? So what a future is, for people who don't know, is it's the price of a commodity or something at a certain point in the future, right? I want to buy oil 10 years out, whatever years out, et cetera. And that creates like a futures demand curve for what the price would be. And usually embeds inflation and things like that. I think it's very helpful to view a yield curve as futures for dollars. So basically, like people are only taking demand of dollars. Like you're only making a loan if you can make an economic gain that's greater than the cost of that debt, right? So if I'm borrowing at 5%, I should be able to make money at 6 or 7%, et cetera. So what those yield curves represent to me is basically the demand for dollars at certain points in time and what banks are going to be able to will into existence at that price point. But also what they encapsulate too is the longer bonds, what makes them go inverted. Again, those very resoundingly encapsulating GDP growth and inflation. That means GDP growth or inflation are going down, right? And that means demand is going down. So what if GDP growth is low, does that mean the economy is booming? Right. So people ascribe like the Fed's keeping rates at zero. Like, no, the rates are so low because like we've been growing at 1 to 2% for a long time. If you notice, all the places with zero rates from the central bank have like no growth. You're not going to see a place with really high rates and no growth, or vice versa. Same with Japan. Like the central bank's not keeping the rate down. Like there's no demand for the debt because there's not growth that justifies the borrowing for it. Because remember, as an economic actor, you're only borrowing if I can invest and make a return. And as a collective, you're going to do that only if you can make money. And so it's a demand for debt kind of thing. And so what an inverted curve means is there's less demand for debt for dollars essentially being loaned into existence at further parts of the curve. That means less dollars will come into existence at later time, and that's usually why it predicts a recession. The curve inverts. Usually, a recession happens like 18-ish months later, so 6 to 18 months roughly, and
Wait,
that's
but there's
because there's
less demand for the dollar than what?
less for demand. The curve's inverted because there's less demand for the dollars in the future. Like growth and things are going down. That's why it predicts a recession typically. And there's less demand for currency for loan generation at later points in the
Less
future.
demand for future dollars. That's what an
Yes,
inverted or it's going down. It means
exactly.
the demand for future dollars is going downward. That's what that
Exactly. And
means.
in an
Okay.
economy, a debt-based economy needs more dollars to grow.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to call it a Ponzi, you can, but that's a debt-based economy needs a continual increase in the dollar supply. Remember, banks make the fucking dollars though. And if there's less demand for dollars, that means there's less loans for them to make. That means there's less economic growth. That means you get a recession. That's why it typically predicts a recession. And that's what you're seeing in the yield curve now. Like, and that's why growth is going to slow down. I don't know if it's going to fall off a cliff, but I read the writing on the wall of what the bond market is saying, which is one of the deepest, most sophisticated ones in the world, and that's the output of it. So yeah, that's why yield curve has value. Yield curves have value in terms of predictive power and what they represent in terms of demand for money.
Wow. So the response to this from the Fed is to so I guess I'm not quite sure how inflation relates to the bond yield curve, but inflation goes up and then the Fed responds by increasing their interest rate, which you're saying actually has no impact on the value of bonds or the curve of bonds. So why do they think that that will help inflation? If as you're saying, a non-growth economy has low interest rates,
Mm-hmm.
and then they raise interest rates, how does that not like completely blow up the entire thing? Because then they're doing the opposite of what they should be doing, it seems like, right?
Yeah, so rates shot up on their own, and they started in around 2020 in 2020. And I went back and I found like all of these press releases and receipts of Fed saying we're not raising rates, we're never raising rates, rates saying zero for 2024. Like I have those receipts. Like, and rates kept going up. Like, they were like, no, we're going up, and they were
You
going up
mean
because we
you
were having
mean non-Fed rates, right? You
yeah,
mean
U.S. Treasury,
normal
U.S.
rates?
Treasury rates.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
yeah, when I say rates like that, I mean like the Treasury bonds, like the T bonds.
Wait, okay. So
Um,
what? Sorry, what is a T bond? Is a 10? Okay, what is a T bond?
So the U.S. government issues debt at certain like not tenures. So like 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, 7 year, 10 year, 20 and 30 year. There might be more. So like a bill is a shorter duration one. A bond is I think 10 and longer. There's one other one I'm forgetting. There's a bill bond. Anyway, that's just parlance though. They're based treasury bonds or bonds the federal government issues to fund itself and take in currency into the fiscal account so it can spend money. So these bonds, though, are viewed as the most premium of collateral, the most premium of, they're very sought after for banks for lending purposes, and people are happy to fund the U.S. government by buying these bonds. And these bonds are what kind of show demand for, those interest rates those bonds produce are the risk-free rates, and they're referenced for economic lending. So the rates those bonds produce in the market are very, very important.
And what are
Um,
you, so say that you're getting, and those are decided not by the Fed, but by the Treasury?
by the Treasury will issue bonds, like they'll sell them to
Yeah.
take in money,
Yeah.
but those interest rates are a product of market demand.
Those are
That's a
market demands.
huge,
Okay.
yeah. It's
Well,
it's the deepest market in the world, and that's just literally hundreds of millions of market participants buying and selling to create this output. That's why, like, it's such a powerful piece of information. It's an output of a complex adaptive system. It's an extremely like powerful signal of what the cost for information is fundamentally, because that's what I think rates are. It's the cost of money, but money is allocated based off information of economic growth, whatever. So it's an
yeah.
extremely powerful signal, and that's why it's such an important metric.
Well, so, okay, but what, a 10-year bond, right? That's giving you a percentage a year, right? Back,
Uh,
or how does that,
yeah.
what are you buying? Do you get paid out at the end of the 10 years? Is it 3%? How does the payout work on, for example, a 10-year bond?
So you get paid out semi-annually, so every 6 months. And that rate, though, in the market, like the U.S. government's paying like a flat rate for it all the time. So it's not paying more or less as it fluctuates, but the bond is getting more or less expensive as it
Yeah.
trades. So if I have to
Sure.
spend like, so say the Treasury's paying 5% on the bond, but say the bond's worth $1,100. I had to pay. So like now I have to pay a little bit more to get 5%. I'm only getting 1,000 back at redemption. So now that 5% is adjusted to be like 4.5, whatever the math is. So that's how that rate changes because
But
of what the
what
price of
is
the bond is.
the rate on the original bond? What is that? Not the value of it, the rate that you're getting paid back,
Mhm.
right? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
how much, if you say it's $1,000, you buy a 10-year bond for $1,000.
Right.
Do you know what you're like getting back
Yeah.
a month or whatever?
You know what the coupon payment is. The coupon
Yeah.
payment is established from the government. I actually don't recall officially how they come up with that. If it's the same, if it's based off a market of the current market rates, I imagine it is, but it's established at the onset.
Yeah.
So you're getting this amount of money on $1,000 principal
Yeah.
every 6 months that
So
payment's
you're
happening.
getting a little percentage. However, for 10 years, you're getting paid back a little percentage, and at the end of the 10, you get the full 1,000 back.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
okay. But
Exactly.
and that amount, that percentage from the 1,000 that you're getting back a month probably has some total percentage, right? It's like 3% over the life of the thing or something, right? I mean, it's something like that.
So yeah, you're getting that annual coupon. You're getting paid that out twice per
Yeah.
year, and
Yeah.
you add to
The
that total
coupon,
amount.
the coupon.
Exactly, coupon payment.
And that's
And
some percentage.
yeah, actually that's a percentage of whatever the principal is, and then the market though will trade that bond though, and
Yeah.
in the price of that bond. So if bonds are bid up,
Mhm.
and that means that the rate goes down, and if bonds are sold, that means the rate goes up,
Yep.
because the bond is cheaper, but you still get the same coupon payment.
I got you.
So yeah, and these bonds fundamentally track. So the interest rate that they produce, if you add up inflation growth, inflation and GDP growth. Say you took like 2%, and say inflation was 3% and GDP growth was 2%. All right. You add those things up on a bar chart, and then you track the 10-year bond, and they'll track almost the same. They'll track literally almost the same thing. In a down market, I found that they track like almost identically when rates are declining. And in an up market, it's a little bit of a lag. So like inflation and GDP growth will move up a little quicker, and then the rates fall soon after. And when you see that connection, then the next question I'd ask for anyone was like the Fed controls this stuff. I'm like, would you say the Fed controls GDP growth with an overnight bank lending rate? You'd be like, well, obviously no, right? Would you say the Fed controls inflation with an overnight bank lending rate? Not only would I think you'd say no, but there are actually plenty of studies from the Fed itself where it's the most pitiful findings you could find. Like if we raise rates 1% with a 4-year lag, there's a 25 to 50 basis point decline. Like it's the most specious, like weak, and this is an entity trying to find something to justify its own existence, and it's
Mm.
so bleak. I don't believe they've done a study on this in like 20 years because it just like it's not there. So it's like if you're not controlling these two outputs with this bank lending rate, then you're not controlling rates. It's not that big of a logical jump here, but it's extremely heterodox from any academic standpoint because they won't look at it that way. They'll just look at it again from a theory standpoint of, well, a 10-year bond is a series of 1-year bonds. So if you control this bond, you control it's just it exists in a realm of just complete like ivory tower kind of rationalization that I feel at its core really, really, really wants this state institution to be as powerful as everyone hopes that it is. And that's why it's like it's a false god. It's like this degree of simping and worship for this institution, even though a lot of guys hate it. I'm like, you still think it's this god tier entity, and it's not controlling this whole thing with buttons. And yeah, I really go into that in like a very strident way because I think it's, especially being in DeFi where we're making new primitives and trying to understand the world a little bit better and how finance works. It's like, let's take this from a genuine first principle standpoint. And here's the data I'm bringing you. I mean, I haven't had anyone, every rejoinder to this is at this point I've seen like every comeback I can see, and I haven't had, I haven't been dunked on yet as far as I can tell, and it's anyway, yeah.
So, okay. So last question before we wrap up.
Okay.
So, okay, the interest rate does not have an impact on the bond yield curve, which is really the Fed interest rate, which is really a much better indicator of like the overall inflation environment and the overall health of the
Growth environment.
economy sort of
Exactly.
thing.
Higher
So,
rates are consistent with higher growth economies. They're
yeah,
not a negative thing.
right.
Like they're an output of, you know, that kind of stuff. And that's why this like tightening by raise, like they're an output of success.
Got it.
They're like higher rates are not this like pernicious thing the Fed raised. Even back in the 70s, where like Alan Volcker raised them a bunch. Like they were, I charted this too. They were already sky fucking high because inflation was high and all that. Anyway, I'm sorry, keep going.
So that would tend to mean that our current rates going up, which they are up, we can't deny that overall rates are up, right?
Yeah, inflation's been up.
That would seem to mean that the economy is actually getting healthier.
Well, it depends on why they're up, I guess, because like they've been up because inflation's been up, right? They went up
Yeah.
because inflation has very clearly and resoundingly been up. Because during 2020, we did a couple things that it doesn't surprise me at all why inflation went up. One, we destroyed the supply side by shutting down supply chains and screwing up all the mechanics of stuff with
Yep. Yep.
COVID.
Yep.
And then the fiscal side airdropped money to everybody. It was the first recession in history where savings went up. We've never had a recession where people made money, like had more savings after. So you gave everybody money and then
Yeah.
you made less resources in the world. Federal Reserve, though, like it's like, dude, guys, come on. Like, look at what occurred. You know, the Fed's been
Yeah.
doing all this shit for a while. We've never had inflation like this. Japan has
Yeah.
never had inflation like this,
Yeah.
despite doing way more QE games than we ever have.
Yeah.
So rates are higher because inflation's been up. Inflation has been stabilizing to trending down, and rates have been actually stabilizing and, you know, slightly down to stable for about a year and a half now. And they'll go down when inflation goes down, or maybe hopefully growth goes up. But right now they seem to be pretty clearly where they are because of inflation. And as that abates, which I think it pretty clearly will, because we've stopped ruining our supply chains and we've stopped handing out fiscal airdrops and money to people, I would expect it's going to go down. But it, you know, it might take a year or two or three to work out the kinks of that. It is a large cycle, but I fully expect that to decline and go back to where it was before. Because why wouldn't it?
So is ZERP real? You
No,
believe in ZERP? ZERP is fake.
no. ZERP is an output of an economic complex adaptive system. ZERP is an output of no growth. That's what it is. ZERP is an
ZERP
output
is
of
an
there being no
output.
growth in the
No.
economy, and the Fed follows. It doesn't lead. It will follow its Fed funds rate down as the other rates go down because it has to, because it's just how it works. And
So
it's not
everybody
dictating.
thinks that ZERP was in the mind of the public. People think that ZERP was because we were so flush with cash, right? That we were hiring idiots to do things that didn't matter, right? Because if we were so flush, everything that didn't matter. There was free money everywhere.
Yeah.
When in reality, what you're saying is a ZERP would be evidence of a unhealthy economic environment that is actually
Yes.
on the downswing, and that's why interest rates are low to begin with.
Right.
And so that's why there would be all this money. Whereas really, when the economy gets better or inflation happens, whatever, when the interest rates go up, actually that means it's a healthier environment, right?
If it's going up because it's growth, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If it's going up because we ruined supply chains, not as much. So there's a little bit of interpretation there.
Yeah.
And the thing about lower rates and like the ZERP thing that people like to comment on, like lower zero interest rates make certain investments more technically valuable, and like certain assets that don't generate cash flow, like a tech stock that aren't profitable maybe right now, or crypto even, When the rate is zero, that means there's less opportunity cost for that investment, which means like, like a DCF, a discounted cash flows. What basically the value of a stock or a crypto, technically of any asset, is technically the cash flows it'll generate discounted back to the current day, and that's
Yeah.
officially the value. Now, the discounting is the product of the risk-free rate typically, or a hurdle rate. So if your rate is zero, you're discounting like the future, you're not discounting as much. So those cash flows, money now is worth more than money later. But if the rate is zero, money later is worth kind of closer to the same as money now. Or I'm sorry, money later is worth closer to the same as money now. So there's less to discount. So these unprofitable things sometimes spike in value from that. Because again, from this DCF framework of what discounting cash flows represents, it means the opportunity cost for that investment is lower. So those future dollars are worth the
Yeah, it's
present,
like
the future dollars will be worth present
in the
terms.
moment, those risks appear less significant because money is just cheaper in that moment, but it actually is not. I think, again, most people think that that is like this gluttonous money's flying around everywhere, but actually it's a sign of a less healthy environment that's actually happening in, which is
Yeah.
fascinating. Dude, this is
Yeah.
absolutely incredible, man. I thank you forever for the rest of my life for teaching me what the Fed rate actually is. I had no idea that's what it was. So, I'm really happy we had this conversation. So, okay,
Yeah,
where do
man.
people find you? What are you doing? What name do you actually go by? Is it, I mean, like, I don't even know exactly what to call you. So,
Yeah, Dmitry. Dmitry's my name. The account I post from on Twitter, it's called at BackTheBunny. And it comes that name comes from me originally making this account actually as a form of like, I started writing as a form of like kind of content marketing in a way for my the project I work for, RabbitX, which is a perpetuals DEX on Ethereum and Starknet. We're a form of DeFi infrastructure, you could say. And I started like writing as a means of like hopefully getting visibility and as a way to keep myself accountable to maybe start producing content more consistently. And anyway, yeah, you can find me on Twitter there. You can find me on Substack as well, which I have linked to my Twitter, also under Back the Bunny. Our logo is a rabbit, so that's where the name comes from. And what else? What other question? Oh, I wanted to say too, you followed everything very well, I feel, because like coming into this as a non-finance guy, like it is weird, and it seems like I'm like it's hard to keep track of it, and I feel like you kept very solid track of it. So kudos to you.
thanks, man.
It
No,
is
dude,
weird.
I love talking about it. It's fascinating. It's just like I actually really do love talking about finance. I find it really, really interesting. It's just like I just have to ask things to really basic shit to be explained. Like, what is a bond? You know what I mean? Because I just don't know. And it's like you need to know those like entry points in order to like grasp the system. But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
actually do a really, really good job of explaining it. And I really appreciate your perspective, man. I mean, I think I have never heard any of this before. So I have never heard anybody say, I've heard the blockchain, the not saying anything bad about DeFi, but I've heard the
Mhm.
blockchain argument 80 million times.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
what you're saying about the nuances of the Fed and these opinions people have about these things that are actually very naive, I have never heard that before. So I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it's great that you're doing this work, man.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's just a very like don't trust what's the word, don't trust verify mindset that I have
Yeah.
inherently.
Yeah.
I have a disagreeable personality, so I guess that kind of where it comes from. But and I also just I don't like lies, like especially when they come from the state, like state
Yeah.
level lies, and especially with like my base like bros and stuff. I'm like, guys, like I get the hate, like you're hating like the right outputs, but like focusing on the wrong thing, and like you're like almost simping for a government institution. Like, don't fucking like, this thing is not as powerful as it says it is. Don't trust a cathedral to tell you it has the word of God behind its back. Like don't believe like literally who's telling you it's powerful. The Fed and its acolytes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
CNBC, Bloomberg. Like, would you believe them about anything else? Would you believe a government opinion about anything else? But here it's like, no, definitely right. Like, that's for sure true. I'm like, that's where it's like it's such a strong psyop, where it's like you really have to like disentangle this orthodoxy to look at it like you were like an engineer looking at something for the first time without anyone telling you else what the right answer is. And it's very hard to look at it from that lens because it's so monolithic about this fucking entity. And that's what kind of pushes me to like write about so much. And that's also why I like DeFi so much too, because it likes really disintermediating a lot of this shit and a lot of these structural problems and annoyances. So
Totally, dude. No, I mean, the reactionaries' biggest weakness is that the liberal is so much better at propaganda than the reactionary. And
they
it's, as
definitely
you're
are.
saying, they're good at making the bad guys and the good guys. And the people that you think are the smartest people, they will fall for this stuff all day. You know, they
Yeah.
won't understand that, as you said, the cathedral telling you that it has the power of God, like, right, like they're fearing this thing that's being set up for them to fear, which it's, I think that's really dead on. All
Yeah,
right,
for
man.
sure.
Well, dude, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. Thanks for talking.